Hi and welcome to another episode of Vantage Point by DG Janis. This is a really special episode as this marks the beginning of our season 2 and we could have asked for none other than Yves Roesti, the CEO of Synpulse today to join us on our first episode. Welcome Yves and thank you for kicking off our season 2.
Thanks a lot for having me, Laksh. I'm happy to be here today.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions for you. This is going to be a very loaded round of questions. First, let me get started because we have a very wide audience across Asia. Why don't you introduce yourself and Synpulse and talk a little bit more about your journey?
Sure. I'm Yves. I'm looking after the Synpulse group as the CEO. And Synpulse is a management consultancy firm with a global reach. We have 16 offices across the globe. We basically cover all the financial centers. And we've just crossed the 1,000 talent mark.
Oh, wow.
Which I'm personally very proud of, given the fact that we doubled the team in the last 2 years. So we're really in a big growth momentum in this market.
So if that is very interesting, where do you see Synpulse going in 5 years from now? 1,000 is a really big number for talent pool, right? Where do you see it going?
We have a good starting point, but because we want to address the momentum in the market, we also have to challenge ourselves. Management consultancy is no more what it used to be. We have to align towards the future. And there are actually 3 areas that we need to invest in. Number one, we are building a tech house at the moment, so really a tech capability. We call that Synpulse 8. That houses all of our tech experts, where we are able to build products and build more of an annuity-based revenue stream, basically. And those are turnkey solutions. And once those are built, that's point number 2, we will actually build them into platforms and we will run it for our clients, fully turnkey.
So Yves, that was absolutely amazing. We want to talk a little bit more about Synpulse 8. However, we want to take a different route right now. First, we want to talk about all the consulting work you do, all the big digital transformation work you do. So one of the things that I personally hear every time I'm speaking to private, priority, retail banks is hybrid wealth management. So I have a series of questions for you on how this will be changing. So the first question is, how do you define hybrid wealth management?
Okay, thanks for that question. Traditionally, the wealth management is a face-to-face relationship. And for good measure, because it's something very bespoke, you need to understand the client's needs very accurately and then implement that into a bespoke solution. However, now with a phenomenon called democratization of wealth, meaning bringing wealth automation to the retail segment, bringing basically investment portfolios to the retail segment, there is this concept of, hey, as a relationship manager, maybe that interface is no longer economically suitable. So we need to introduce automation in that space. And then we hear self-service or automated advisory, where you basically are presented with an automated portfolio for you as a client. So that's basically the hybrid wealth. And there are many in-between segments that you can define as to a client service model that has a mix between RM and automation.
Absolutely. So now let me ask you a difficult question. Are RMs going to be disrupted or extinct with the advent of hybrid wealth management?
Yeah, that's a very, that's a hypothesis that's being asked a lot. I would respond to it, maybe make an analogy towards the clothing industry, where you up until today you still have tailors, right, that make bespoke suits. So I think on the top end, with the ultra high net worth, you will always have a very bespoke relationship, and that's the relationship manager, and that will not be replaced. You might have a Zoom call or a video call, but that interface will not be automated anytime soon. On the lower end, and taking again the clothing analogy, you might have might have H&M, right, where you have more off-the-rack clothes, but they fulfill a certain purpose as well for many people. You just take the risk of walking around with the same clothes as others, and if you bring that back to portfolios, you might have the same investment proposal as others with your risk characteristics.
Oh wow, that is absolutely an amazing example. I had never thought of it like that. Anytime somebody asks me that question, I just say it is up to the RMs whether they want to be disrupted like the accountants who were bean counters and now they are advisors, consultants, etc., or the elevator men or the lift men who are no longer to be found anywhere. So I think the industry is at a tipping point where the role of an RM would change as compared to the segment, and you correctly mentioned where there is need for democratization or there is no need for absolute differentiation of the portfolio. A large number of people could have the same portfolio as well.
Right.
So that is very interesting. Now, how do you see, you talked about different segments, etc., right? So, and it was pretty obvious that you said the ultra high net segment would have RMs, right? But let's say retail would be platform driven. How do you see this playing in the high net worth mass affluent segment? So would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of investments currently are going, really to bring the offerings down. What we call this segment of one. So we try to create a unique bespokeness through automation and bring it to the lower segment.
Okay. And do you still see RMs playing a role there, or will this go to like completely platform-based, personalization? How do you see that happening?
So on the lower end, that has to be fully automated. With maybe it could be that there's a call center behind it to sort of catch the more sophisticated requests. But then the moment you traverse further up, then things become a bit more personal. And also the needs, right, at that level are evolving, right, and cannot be served by just technology, but the understanding is much more complex.
Okay, and that is a very nice, balance of how we could look at hybrid wealth management across the segment. Now, I want to share an instance with you, and I want to get your thoughts on it. A few weeks ago, I was with this MD of a very big global bank, and he suggested that one of his RM puts more trade in a day than the entire trades given by the self-direct platform in a month. So, and he's like, we are seeing no ROI on our self-direct or self-serve platform. Why are banks not able to see ROI on this self-direct platforms?
Yeah, I mean, typically creating a digital channel is basically a must-have these days. Yeah. And if you just look at the foundational features, then a bank needs to spend, north of $4 million just to build that, right? And the bigger the bank, you will have double-digit budgets in that space. So the question is, okay, how do you, create an ROI over this? Especially foundational, there is none. But think of it, right? This will eventually replace the branches and allows you to add on additional value-add features. So some private banks now starting to build on certain advisory features or even self-service execution features that then add to the revenue stream. Another example is a bit more generic, but also impacts in my personal life. I sign about 10 contracts every day.
Oh, nice.
And I used to courier them to the various offices. Yeah. And nowadays we switch completely to e-signatures. And it makes my life super easy, but also saves a lot on courier costs, right? And banking is still very paper heavy at the top end anyways with private banks. And that's the transformation that brings a lot of benefits.
Right. Okay, I have one more tricky question for you. And so banks are historically seeing very low NPS scores. They know their digital experience is not that great. And now they're competing with these fintechs and they have to have a digital wealth management strategy. How are the banks coping up with this?
That's a big challenge for them, especially also because their clientele, next generations are coming, and they're expecting a similar experience as they have with digital native businesses. Not only banks, they're doing their shopping, they're doing their other things over such platforms, and they're used to sort of this instant gratification, They have gamification principles, etc. And then they move over to the banking side and it completely drops, right? And I think we have not, or the banks have not yet found the ultimate recipe around that. Here I would also encourage that we should experiment a lot more.
Yeah.
And some banks are doing that, going into even Web 3.0, etc., which I believe is very crucial to really leapfrog in your portfolio of projects to anticipate what's coming in the future.
Absolutely. So you have given me a lot of points there to deep dive into. So we are going to do exactly that, and thank you for that answer. So you mentioned something, personalization being really important as a part of wealth management. And personalization at scale is a concept that is being talked about everywhere, hyper-personalization, personalization at scale. So first, want to get your thoughts on, what does this even mean, hyper-personalization?
I mean, that's a buzzword, obviously, and something to strive for. We call this segment of one. So what that means is you create a bespoke experience at every level, right? And through data, you can actually achieve that. Maybe I'll give you an example. I mean, most banks sit on a treasure chest of data. Over years, they've collected transactional data, client data, etc. Now think of it, most segments currently and the segment strategies are done based on asset under management, right? So you have, retail, affluent, and then private banking, and maybe you have sub-segments. But what happens if we can actually divide those segments into other clusters, things like hobbies, profession, geography, or even religion? Then it gets really powerful. One thing we're working on quite a bit is this portfolio recommendation engines, whereby we ingest data and we cluster based on client preferences. Yeah. And within client clusters, we then infer recommendations. Sort of think of like the Amazon where, when you browse, it says readers like you have also read XYZ, yeah, right? Yeah. And so the same mechanism would then come from a portfolio proposal point of view, maybe not directly to the client, but maybe as an assistant and empowerment to the RM for him to have a more value-add conversation. Because people want to compare themselves against, the same peer groups, right? Yeah, so it's always contextual. So I think hyper-personalization means, contextualization towards the clients and the client's need.
And that is a very interesting definition. And, we've heard this for so many years now. I have personally been reading about banks talking about hyper-personalization for like last 4 or 5 years. Why has nobody rolled it out if this looks like this silver bullet towards engaging clients? Why is nobody rolling it out?
So first of all, you need data, yeah, right? And the data, so you need to have all the data in a coherent and consistent way. And then also from a clustering perspective, you need to model this appropriately. And then with the modern principles of, let's say, machine learning, those models have to be trained and then validated and so on and so forth. So there are initiatives about to roll this out, so it's still in the making. And I think the industry will eventually come to terms with this technology. But it needs to be tested.
Thank you, Yves, for that answer. So now one question is, do you see hyper-personalization, because it is about personalization, right, playing out differently between the current gen and the next gen customers? Do you see that happening, or do you see the foundation would be the same and just the way it is being done, like the small nuances of it would be different?
Yeah, that's a good point. On the lower end, it has to have an automation angle towards it, yeah, right? That's also where probably most of the investment dollar will go, yeah, to really relieve the advisor. Because if you do it on your own, you can always give the advice, but it's not very scalable, yeah, right? So you need automation, and for that you need data. So I think on the lower tiers that will be automated and brought in an efficient way. On the upper end, I think it will still be very personal.
Okay, and now one of the things that has caught the imagination of a lot of people is digital assets. You have seen the meteoric rise of Bitcoin and then the fall and then the rise again. So let me ask you this question in a few layers. What is the appeal of Bitcoin or digital assets to the current gen versus the next gen? You could split that answer. What is the appeal to them?
So I would say there's three types that approach this field differently. You have the traditionalists, they're more conservative, they see this as speculation, right? If we talk about the crypto secondary market. And they will wait until the hype curve flattens, right? And it established maybe as an asset class eventually, then they might step in. And then you have the analytical futurists that have a clear view and they understand the seismic shift of disintermediation that actually blockchain technology will bring. And they're avid, they're very avid in terms of analyzing and investing in the space. And then there's a third bucket, and we have many of our talents that are in this, I call them sort of like the risk takers. Yeah. And they're generation alpha, so they're very young, they've grown up now with this and they go all in, right? They also have probably more time spent to cover, from a downturn. But they also have, towards us as employers, need to be mindful of this. They have requirements like that. So that's also a reason why we tokenized Synpulse as our own. We have a tokenized employee share ownership program whereby everybody has a piece of ownership of the success of the Synpulse group. And with this, we have a currency amongst ourselves that is fully liquid and almost like a share price, if you will. Okay. Yeah? And that's appreciated, and I think that's also where we need to experiment more. One of the areas that we're investigating at the moment, and also a request from these risk takers, is people want to get paid in crypto, for example, as a salary. Yeah. And that's an interesting thought. Something we'd be very happy to also pick up and implement. And we're currently experimenting around that. Also, since you're in the world of smart contracts, why do we need to pay salary once per month? I mean, that's a very traditional view. Why not we create a streaming salary, right? That is just continuous, right? With smart contracts, you can do that. Yeah. Yeah. And so there are many innovations that are coming. And so I would not just throw them into the risk taker bucket and forget. I think they bring a lot of challenges and good innovation points to us.
Absolutely. So if we hit 1 million impressions on this episode, does this impact the value of the Synpulse coin?
I hope, because then maybe many people will join us and we have a lot more talents. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm getting not paid a single Synpulse coin or cent for saying this. But that is absolutely very interesting that, the industry needs certain good use cases on blockchain and crypto that, as you mentioned, the smart contract piece, and that can, lay the foundation for future work of crypto. Now, and with that, Synpulse coin is different, as you mentioned, but how does one value something like Bitcoin, which is so volatile? I have a very decent, or I should say small size portfolio after hearing your thoughts. And I hear every day I'm getting these alerts, 5% up, 10% down, 8% here, 10% there. How do you value something that is so volatile?
That is a crystal ball question. I'm sure there are methodologies, right, on how you can value. And I'm not a financial analyst, so I cannot comment on that. But what I can comment on is also the journey, how we came to the Synpulse token. And so it's actually a use case that's running on a blockchain. So we had to first choose the blockchain framework that we want to apply. And we saw that the Ethereum, so it's an ERC20 based token, the Ethereum blockchain offers actually the right platform for us. And we deployed it on the mainnet, and now it's there, right? I mean, we're transacting with it. Every year when we issue tokens, we pay transaction fees, gas fees, right? So we're actually adding to the value of the network, and I could not just migrate it over to another chain. So we derive value from that. So I think You were absolutely right when you said, the upstream use cases will define the value of the blockchain. And there, I think we need to look at the utility value of such blockchains, actually, right? Not like cryptos per se, but where you actually have a platform to build upon. Take, for example, Sandbox or Decentraland as the two bigger metaverse propositions. Those are upstream use cases. I mean, Sandbox was a gaming company that then decided to build it onto blockchain and allow people ownership in the game, which is really striking. So I think that's the next step that we will see. And Synpulse, we are working currently on our metaverse presence.
Okay, now you have given me some fodder for the next question. This is like crystal ball time. Look into your crystal ball and tell me, how do you see crypto, blockchain, and metaverse changing in the next 5 years?
So the adoption will go up, definitely. We will have to find the right engagement and identity for people to actually start to use it more and more and more. And I think this is already happening. We see many brands going in there. We see many clients and prospects going in there. Even our new recruits will probably engage with us through a platform like this. Honestly, there's a lot of experimentation that we need to try, and we see how it actually ends up. Where exactly it will land is really the crystal ball, but I do believe that there will be a hybrid world emerging for us.
Right. And why do you think these topics are so polarizing? Why do you have fanboys and people who actually hate it? Like, it is very difficult to find somebody who's very balanced like you. So now I want to ask you, why have we these two extreme ends of people in this space?
Well, I had to read into it, right? But you're right. I mean, we grew up with very tangible sort of picture of the world, right? Yeah. Anything that you can touch has a value. Yep. And so the new generation doesn't have that necessarily anymore, right? Sometimes I observe families at the table and the kids are just really only in their space. Teenagers are completely on the phone. That's their channel into virtual, right? And they develop identity through those channels. And we cannot forget, if the identity really comes down to, a virtual world, then that also can become a unit of value to an individual. Yeah. Right, and I think that transition that will happen probably much faster than we would like, especially us that are used to the tangible side of things. But I really believe this is happening.
Does this thought scare you that our kids? I am a father to a 6-month-old kid, right? So does this thought scare you that the kids will relate to an identity which is based on some online persona or avatar?
So there's this movie called Ready Player One, and I highly recommend to watch and see how that could look like. That has some scary elements. My son is turning 8, and he's actually he's building swords for Sandbox and uploading them. And I find it fantastic, rather than playing Minecraft, he's actually creating something, and I think this is brilliant, yeah. So I think we need to embrace it, and there's always pros and cons.
Okay, I have many years to do that. So, I don't see my 6-month-old daughter getting on Metaverse anytime soon. So I have my time. So thank you for that answer. That was really insightful. That demonstrates, your depth of understanding of these segments, etc. Now, going a little bit more into the wealth management side of it. So thank you, Yves, for answering that. And since you are so good at answering contentious questions, I have a series of questions for you, which are very contentious as well. In the last 3 years, what I've noticed is the amount of competition that has come into wealth management is immense. There are banks which are completely just focused on wealth management now. Asia seems to be the growth engine. Mm-hmm. EAMs and family offices, seem to be mushrooming. So I want to ask you a series of questions about the competition landscape. As a private bank or a wealth manager, with all this competition, how do you differentiate yourself?
That's a good question. There are two areas typically. One is the service excellence, and the other thing is the product side, right? The product shelf. And you're right, differentiation is necessary because otherwise it's too much me too, right? And then it becomes a margin compression play, and there's not much. It will be very difficult business model thereafter. So I think for service excellence, it's all about the client interface and how you engage the client, and also digitally how you engage him, obviously. And on the product side, I think we're seeing some really interesting developments, especially with emerging product asset classes like crypto, and how banks are dealing with this.
Yeah. Do you feel the industry is too regulated to create an innovative differentiator?
Sometimes quite the opposite. I think the industry was not regulated, and hence we had also the hiccups as of recent time in the crypto space. I think maybe to change your question a bit, I think the internal compliance is very strong in the banks to allow any kind of such innovation to happen or experiments. And I would urge the industry to become a bit more entrepreneurial when it comes to such new products, because the banks still hold, first of all, the license, and they hold the trust of their client, and that's a big asset when it comes to new products.
Yeah, one of the best examples of entrepreneurship that I've seen in the financial industry is the external asset management industry, or the family offices being set up. Now, how in Europe they have like 30 to 40% market share, if I understand that correctly. It is still early days for the industry in Asia. What is the appeal of these to the investors, and how do you see it playing out in Asia? The growth of the industry that I mean.
So talking about the economics quickly, you're right, in Switzerland it's 30% of the asset under management are actually taken care by independent external asset managers. In APAC we're roughly at 5%, so we're factor 6 apart, but it's growing rapidly. Now the question is, okay, is this is this intermediating the private banks? Is that a problem? Honestly, looking at some of our clients, there is also coexistence, and actually as part of it's part of an ecosystem. We have one client that is making 50% of their revenues through external asset manager as a bank, right? So I think it's a model that will prevail, that will always be there, because some clients do appreciate an independent advice, and the custody will then be done by the respective banks that offer solutions to those external asset managers.
Okay, now let me ask you a contentious question. I have worked with the external asset management industry. The primary driver of that industry is it is a different business model than a private bank. That it is more independent, it is more an advisory-led model, where you pay a management fee based on your assets, and you are not paying transaction fee. At least you're hoping for that, right? Now, all of these things are something that the bank could transition into. Do you think the big private banks could transition their business model and completely wipe out the EAM industry, at least in Asia?
Well, one needs to think of the proposition of an external asset manager on its own. It is typically a relationship manager that has been with a bank, that has seen that he or she wants to provide more flexible solution to their clients. And he cannot do that within the corset of the private bank, and therefore for him that's the step away. So they have typically very sticky relationship with their clients. So I don't think this wiping out will be will work per se, because they run different propositions altogether, plus the stickiness of the client. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we are not looking at wiping out, and personally I would want the industry to flourish. That was one of the first industries I worked into. So, I wanted to flourish, but I do like putting you on the tough spot and, asking you these tricky questions. Now with increased competition comes increased customer acquisition costs. And we are seeing some concepts flying around where, banks are saying we will have wealth continuum and we will be pure play PB, etc. Wealth continuum seems a very fancy term, which, hasn't been used up until now. First of all, how do you define wealth continuum?
Let's start with that.
Yeah.
And Wealth Continuum, by the way, was coined 8 years ago by one of the local banks already, and we're involved in that process. In our definition, it basically means that the journey with the client starts on a lower segment, typically on the retail side, and then you mature this relationship, and the client gets a seamless transition, and the service level increases as he transitions further up, right? And he gets more and more and more. So it continues, right? So he will never lose. The client doesn't have to change apps. He doesn't have to offboard and re-onboard. And mind you, that's still the case in with certain institutions here, right? Yeah. Between segments, that there's an offboarding and a re-onboarding. So not always is it that seamless. Now, one of the local banks has already mastered this, and honestly, I think that was key to their success. But it's not just the client segment that is continuous. It's also the operating model behind that needs to be continuous. Yep. In that particular case, we had to look at growth, not just of the client, but also of the relationship manager that can then go and move up into the higher segments, and it's a career progression for this person. And so rather than hanging on keeping the client in the affluent space with a very high AUM and probably needs, emerging from this, they actually then hand it off to the next, or can actually transition to the next segment and can get the service that they need at that level.
Right. So you mentioned something very interesting there. You talk not only about the client's journey, but also the RM's journey. And that is very interesting. So how do you think banks in today's world can prepare for wealth continuum?
So first and foremost, they have to break the silos between the segments, right? So the arm can actually also transition into the higher segments. And that has to do, it sounds very easy, but it's not, because typically those business units are organized very separately. And that goes all the way over to, of course, also remuneration, right? And question on how you grandfather a client that is moving up because there's a loss of revenue on the lower segment, So, but from an overall bank's point of view, this makes sense, right? So I think that's one. And then, of course, technology needs to enable this transition as well. But I think that the former is harder to achieve than the latter.
Yeah, and technology is one challenge, but the mindset of people, processes, etc., that is absolutely a bigger challenge because there is an inherent or latent inertia, if you may call it that, to move towards these newer models, etc. Technology is one problem that you invest a few $100 million, hopefully, and things get better. So that is a very insightful part of it. So how do you see pure play banks and aggressively targeting ultra high net worth customers? Their intent is to retain these customers and make them multi-generational customers. And then there are these pure play PBs which are now trying to get into the high net worth segment. How do you see these two cooperating, playing, and competing with each other? And where is this headed to?
So it used to be that private banking starts, at a certain threshold. Yeah. I think there's also a definition of AI and PI. So Hong Kong has this professional investor definition. I think Singapore is accredited investor, and that's where sort of the sophistication is there, and also the regulatory burden gets less, right? Before that is actually considered a retail investor. So that was no-go territory, or is no-go territory typically for private banks because their processes and operating models are not calibrated to serve that level. So much so that we had clients that that have done an acquisition, and through the acquisition we actually divested everyone that did not fulfill that threshold. Yep. But given the automation potential that technology brings, there is actually there could be an appeal in that segment as well, as we've seen with the tier one Singaporean banks that manage actually this segment very efficiently. So I do believe there's a big appeal of that segment. Whether now the bigger pure play would go after such a segment, I doubt, right? It's not their sweet spot per se.
Okay. Just before our interview, I saw an ad from a pure play attracting funds from $1 million to $5 million in asset under management. So let's see how this plays out, because this is very interesting space. So now, as we were talking about this, mass affluent segment, now let's get into a segment, step down, and let's get into the digital banking segment, the digital native banks. We have seen a flurry of licenses being given out in Singapore and Malaysia. How do you react to the regulators in these countries handing out digital-only bank licenses?
It's very exciting for us because there are new clients that are emerging with needs to build up fresh neobanks, right, with a complete new approach towards architecture, client service model, etc. And typically, they're digital natives. That means they have had digital business models before. That's number one. And second, they are typically not financial institutions. Yeah? They have never been doing banking transactions. So that actually comes into or plays into our strength, because we have 25 years of domain experience. And also, just from our experience, it takes about 2 years and north of 100 million to build a fully fledged neobank.
Yeah.
And then it takes about 50 million a year plus to actually operate them.
Yeah.
So you need to have a super strong business case to turn a profit, right? And that's all about then the scalability that comes behind this. So by right, you could see that also currently, that certain neobanks are folding because the business case did not work out and that scalability did not come in. And I do believe that if the current license taker, they will always have an upstream proposition where they plug into a scalability play, be it a grocery conglomerate, be it a telco, right, or being the ride-hailing,
Players, yeah.
Exactly.
So, Yves, you mentioned something very interesting there, that digital banks or digital natives have to find the right business model, and we have seen some examples in Australia with all the right intent and all the technology. Also, they couldn't find the right business model, right? Now, let's come to a country like Singapore. We have some very good offerings by the incumbent banks. And I feel like we are overbanked. Everybody has multiple banking relationships, etc. and stuff. And I never feel that the digital banking apps I'm using, they lack anything. So what value proposition does a digital native bank offer in a country like Singapore?
It is a bit of a paradox, no? Why would somebody start a neobank here where it's already people are overbanked? And I think the merit of this question is correct. I think many of those players are actually building their minimal viable product here as a testing ground, and scalability then will come by going into the emerging markets. That's really where the business case will carry. Because if you think of it, and we did some calculation, any of the newly launching banks now, they will have, not to be disrespectful, but it's a bit of a Me Too offering, right? We have a credit card, we have a wallet, we have an account, and we have payment rails, and we have, a mobile app. Yeah, that's differentiating. So any one of those players would need to get to north of 500,000-600,000 customers in order to break even, given the running cost. And if you think of that, that's 10% of Singapore.
Yeah.
So how much effort do you need to, exert in order to get to that level? That's humongous. So it cannot be a Singapore play only.
Yeah.
So there must be a regional play behind those. And we see that as well. We see Grab Singtel going to Malaysia as well, right? We see others going towards Indonesia. So I really think that seemingly it doesn't make sense, but it's actually an MVP in order to roll it out.
Yeah.
And then maybe just to relate back to what you said earlier about the incumbents having all the feature set already that you could look for. But I think there's also transformation going on because culturally, many of those institutions still work in a legacy mode.
Yeah.
And that's also why certain players have started to build their own standalone organization in a completely new way with a new culture, a new leadership, and also new technology principles.
So that is a very interesting point. Now, you mentioned that you play a strategic role with these new digital banks, right? I would be very keen to understand how are you helping them prepare for this journey of going regional, getting the value propositions out there, and being agile. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and that plays into our Synpulse 8, our tech house, because we saw that the expertise that's needed is especially supporting them in the tech build-up. But not just that, the combination with us as management consultants with 25 years plus experience, we can actually bring our domain models to the tech house, and it can help them really accelerate. Our vision is, as Synpulse, we want to actually help all those emergent neobanks with a starter kit, whereby you don't have to spend 2 years and 100 millions on, let's say, an MVP. This should be out of the box, right? That's non-differentiating anyways, right? But you need to have it.
Yep.
So why not we create that as a product, and then our clients can build upon that or can use it as an accelerator towards their neobanking journey. It will bring down the economics and will help them with the time to market.
Yeah. And with $100 million spent, how does a bank even break even, and how long will it take for them to break even?
That's a good question. Depends on how strong they can run the business acquisition afterwards, of course. Yeah.
So thank you. Very, very interesting answers. We are getting to the end of the episode now. So have a couple of very interesting questions. You were talking about how you're helping digital native banks transform, right? Or get started. I would love to hear a couple of very interesting projects or business transformation or digital transformation projects that you're doing across the banking industry. You can't talk about digital natives anymore. So, private banking, retail, or those kind of examples.
Mm-hmm. So digital natives aside, we have a long heritage on wealth management and private banking platforms. And we can see a wave of transformation projects emerging in the emerging markets these days. We have about 12 full core banking transformations running across Indonesia, Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand, and Malaysia, where we're basically, where clients want to reap the benefits of wealth management onshore, because so far wealth management and private banking has been largely for them offshore, right, which is Singapore and Hong Kong mainly. And through their own growth, and those geographies have also grown quite a bit and the needs have developed, they are now investing into wealth management platforms. Yeah. And so we're helping, at the moment, about 12 of those projects are running in concurrence.
Oh, wow. Now, that is very interesting. And, as we end this episode, we always ask everybody, what do they want to change in wealth management, which we'll ask you as well. I also want you to look into your crystal ball and predict how wealth management would be different in 5 years, at least in Asia, right? So 2 questions. How would you change wealth management, and your 5-year prediction of how it will change?
Okay, so well, we can talk about wealth management going into the Metaverse, but I'm not going to say that. I think what I would like to change, if I could wish, is for the institutions to be courageous and experiment a bit more. There are pockets of that, so there's innovation centers being formed and experiments being driven, but sometimes we see that this is done in isolation, and then it doesn't translate into a real sort of change after all. So we can take, for example, the suitability thing that is mainly compliance driven, right? Since the 2008 GFC, Why look at this as a business disabler, to do much more requirements in order to advise the client? Why not look at it as a business enabler? Because you now have stringent methodologies on how to evaluate portfolios and have a meaningful conversation with the client because his portfolio is out of whack with, what it should be. And so I think really changing the mindset of, being compliant, stringent, and disabling rather than being open and embracing and experimenting. And here I would also say, work with us. Synpulse is here. We co-create with many clients. Yeah. You can use us as a springboard, as an innovation partner. And I'm very happy to try out new things, including the Metaverse. Yeah, if you look at the next 5 years, including the Metaverse presence of those institutions. Yeah.
So Yves, we are not letting you go before you answer this one question. What is one thing that is going to change for sure in the wealth management industry in 5 years?
So I'm going to take a bet here. Okay. I believe our mobile phone has all of our data, knows where we've been. If we can combine this into our investment advisory, and if the private bank can harvest that data, that would create a proposition which is unbelievable. And I believe that this will happen over time.
Absolutely. We are on the same side of the bet. Let me just clarify, because I have been a very vocal proponent and saying hyper-personalization is a very big opportunity, and mobile phone data could lead hyper-personalization right to a very different level, So absolutely agree with that. We are on the same side of the bet for anyone trying to bet with us. But thank you, Yves. This has been an absolute pleasure for having you on this episode. Thank you so much for being part of our journey and answering all these questions so candidly. Thank you.
Thank you, Laksh. Pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.